The desert heat shimmered off the runway as Captain Sarah "Viper" Rodriguez guided her A-10 Thunderbolt II through a hail of enemy fire, her aircraft's GAU-8 cannon spitting death at 3,900 rounds per minute while 285 Marines trapped in the valley below counted every second until rescue or annihilation. The same woman they'd called too fragile for the Warthog just 8 months earlier was now their only hope for survival. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada had always been a crucible for combat pilots, but the A-10 training program was something else entirely. Known as the Hog Driver Academy among military aviation circles, it separated the elite close air support pilots from everyone else with a brutality that matched the aircraft itself. The A-10 Thunderbolt II wasn't designed for glory or speed. It was built around a 30mm cannon specifically to destroy tanks and provide close air support to ground troops in the most dangerous combat environments imaginable. Flying the Warthog required a special kind of pilot, someone who could think like infantry while flying like a fighter jockey, who could make split-second decisions with friendly forces mere meters from their targets. Sarah Rodriguez had dreamed of flying the A-10 since she was 12 years old, watching thunder overhead during an air show at Lackland Air Force Base, where her father worked as a maintenance crew chief. While other kids pointed at the sleek F-16s and F-22s, Sarah was mesmerized by the ugly, unglamorous aircraft that looked more like a flying tank than a fighter jet. Her father, Master Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, had worked on A-10s for 15 years and understood their brutal effectiveness better than most. "Mia," he'd told her that day as they watched the demonstration, "those pretty jets up there, they're for show. But the Warthog? That's the plane that brings soldiers home alive. It's not about looking good in the sky. It's about being so tough and so precise that you can fly into hell and pull your ground troops out the other side." Growing up on military bases across the Southwest, Sarah had absorbed every story, every technical manual, every piece of wisdom her father shared about the A-10. She learned about the aircraft's redundant systems, its ability to fly with half a wing missing, its legendary durability in combat. More importantly, she learned about the pilots who flew them, men and women who viewed their role not as warriors seeking glory, but as guardians whose entire purpose was protecting ground forces who couldn't protect themselves. By the time Sarah entered the Air Force Academy, she was already more knowledgeable about A-10 systems than most flight instructors. Her academic performance was flawless, her physical fitness scores consistently maxed out, and her flight simulation results placed her in the top 5% of her class. During her senior year, when cadets submitted their aircraft preferences for pilot training, Sarah's first, second, and third choices were all the same: A-10 Thunderbolt. Her academic advisor, Colonel Patricia Hayes, had tried to dissuade her during their final counseling session. "Rodriguez, you've got the scores for anything you want," Hayes had said, reviewing Sarah's file. F-35 Lightning, F-22 Raptor, even the B-2 program if you're interested in strategic missions. Why limit yourself to close air support? The A-10 program is being downsized, and frankly, it's not exactly a career advancement track. Sarah had looked the colonel directly in the eyes and responded with the confidence that would later become her trademark in combat situations. "Ma'am, respectfully, I didn't join the Air Force to advance my career. I joined to save lives. And there's no aircraft in our inventory that saves more ground troops than the A-10. Colonel Hayes had noted the determination in Sarah's voice and approved her request, but privately wondered if the young woman truly understood what she was asking for. The A-10 community was notoriously insular, dominated by pilots who'd proven themselves in multiple combat deployments, flying one of the most dangerous missions in military aviation. It wasn't just about flying skills. Close air support required a unique mindset, the ability to operate in chaotic environments where the difference between hitting enemy positions and accidentally targeting friendly forces could be measured. In meters, after graduating third in her academy class, Sarah was selected for pilot training at Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas. The initial phase went smoothly. She excelled in the T-6 Texan trainer, then transitioned seamlessly to the T-38 Talon for advanced training. Her instructors noted her exceptional spatial awareness, her ability to remain calm under pressure, and most importantly, her precision in weapons delivery systems. Everything pointed toward a successful transition to fighter aircraft, but it was during the final phase of training, when students were assigned to their specific aircraft tracks, that Sarah first encountered the institutional resistance that would define her early career. The assignment officer, Major Robert Blackwood, called her into his office on a sweltering afternoon in July with news that would change everything. "Rodriguez," Blackwood had said, his tone carrying the practiced authority of someone who delivered unwelcome news many times before. "I've got your assignment orders. You're being reassigned to the KC-135 Stratotanker program. Aerial refueling. Congratulations." Sarah felt the floor drop away beneath her. "Sir, respectfully, there must be some mistake. My scores qualify me for A-10 training, and that was my primary request." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying her with the expression of someone who'd already made up his mind. "Rodriguez, let me be frank with you. The A-10 community is a brotherhood. These guys have been flying combat missions together for decades, and they depend on each other in ways you can't imagine. When you're providing close air support with friendly forces 50 meters from your target, there's no room for hesitation, no room for second-guessing, and definitely no room for pilots who might crack under pressure. Sir, my performance evaluations show I perform better under pressure, not worse." "On paper, maybe," Blackwood replied. "But paper doesn't account for what happens when you're flying into a hot landing zone with surface-to-air missiles lighting up the sky and Marines on the ground screaming for immediate support. The A-10 community has standards, Rodriguez. Standards that have kept them alive and effective for 40 years. Adding variables to that equation isn't something we do lightly." Sarah understood immediately what Blackwood wasn't saying directly. The variable he was concerned about wasn't her flying ability or her academic performance, it was her gender. Despite decades of women serving successfully as pilots in the Air Force, certain communities remained resistant to change, and the A-10 world was apparently one of them. "Major, with respect, I've trained my entire life for this assignment. My father maintained A-10s for 15 years. I know these aircraft better than most pilots who've never worked on them, and my scores demonstrate I'm qualified for the mission." Blackwood's expression hardened. "Rodriguez, this conversation is over. Your orders are for KC-135s, and that's where you're going. The Air Force has invested considerable resources in your training, and you'll serve where you're needed most." Dismissed. As Sarah walked out of Blackwood's office, her assignment papers feeling like lead in her hands, she realized this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The institutional resistance she'd encountered wasn't about her qualifications or her potential. It was about perceptions, assumptions, and a military culture that still struggled to accept that combat effectiveness had nothing to do with gender. That evening, Sarah called her father from her quarters at Laughlin. Master Sergeant Rodriguez listened quietly as she explained what had happened, his years of military experience helping him understand the political dynamics his daughter was facing. "Mia," he said finally, his voice carrying both anger and determination, "they're not rejecting you because you can't fly the Warthog. They're rejecting you because they're afraid you'll prove you can fly it better than they can. But remember, what I taught you about the A-10, it's built to take hits and keep flying. Sometimes that's what you have to do too. So what do I do, Dad? Accept the tanker assignment and give up on everything I've worked for?" Miguel Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment before responding. You take the assignment they're giving you, and you become the best damn tanker pilot the Air Force has ever seen. But you don't give up on the A-10, you find another way. There's always another way, Mia. You just have to be tough enough to find it, and smart enough to take it when it comes. As Sarah hung up the phone and stared out at the Texas night sky, she made a decision that would define the next phase of her military career. She would excel in whatever assignment they gave her, but she would also prepare for the day when circumstances would force them to reconsider their assumptions about who could handle the A-10 Thunderbolt II. What Sarah couldn't know that night was that less than 2 years later, a crisis in the Middle East would create exactly the opportunity she needed, and that 285 Marines trapped in a valley surrounded by enemy forces would depend on her ability to prove everyone wrong. Sarah's assignment to the 340th Air Refueling Squadron at McConnell Air Force Base in Kansas felt like exile, but she approached it with the same precision and dedication that had carried her through the academy. The KC-135 Stratotanker was a different beast entirely from the A-10, a massive lumbering aircraft designed to keep other planes in the air rather than bring destruction to ground targets. For someone who dreamed of close air support missions, flying a flying gas station felt like professional purgatory, but Sarah had inherited her father's work ethic and understood that excellence in any assignment would eventually open doors. Within 6 months, she'd become one of the squadron's most reliable pilots, known for her ability to execute complex refueling operations in challenging weather conditions. Her precision in formation flying was legendary among the crews she supported, and fighter pilots specifically requested her aircraft for difficult missions because they knew she could hold position in turbulence that would defeat lesser pilots. The irony wasn't lost on her that the skills that made her exceptional at aerial refueling were exactly the same ones required for close air support: spatial awareness, the ability to maintain precise positioning relative to other aircraft, and the steady nerves required to operate in close proximity to high-performance jets. Every day she spent flying tanker missions was actually advanced training for the A-10. Though her superiors didn't seem to recognize the connection. It was during a routine training exercise over the Nevada test range that Sarah first encountered Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hammer Thompson, the commanding officer of the 66th Weapons Squadron, the elite A-10 unit based at Nellis Air Force Base. Sarah's KC-135 had been assigned to support a large force exercise involving multiple A-10s, practicing close air support scenarios, and she watched with professional fascination as the Warthogs maneuvered through the simulated battlefield below. Thompson's voice crackled over the radio as he coordinated the exercise, his tone carrying the authority of someone who'd flown hundreds of combat missions. Tanker 77, this is Hog Lead. We're going to need you to maintain a station about 15 miles north of the target area. Some of our newer pilots are still learning fuel management on extended CAS missions. Copy, Hog Lead, Sarah responded. Tanker 77 holding at Angels 20, ready for customers. Over the next 3 hours, Sarah watched the A-10 cycle through their refueling rotations, each pilot bringing their aircraft alongside her tanker with varying degrees of skill. The experienced pilots made it look effortless, sliding into formation with practiced ease. The newer pilots struggled with the delicate balance required to maintain position while taking on fuel, their aircraft wobbling in the turbulence created by the massive tanker. It was during one of these refueling operations that Sarah made an observation that would later prove crucial. One of the younger A-10 pilots was having difficulty maintaining position in moderate turbulence, his aircraft oscillating dangerously close to her wing. Sarah made a minute adjustment to her flight path, reducing the turbulence in the refueling envelope and allowing the struggling pilot to complete his fuel transfer safely. Nice flying, Tanker 77, came Thompson's voice over the radio. That was some smooth air you provided for Hog 2-4. Just doing my job, Hog Lead, Sarah replied. But she could hear the subtle approval in Thompson's tone. After the exercise, Sarah was surprised to receive a message requesting her presence at a debrief session normally reserved for the A-10 pilots. She arrived at the briefing room at Nellis to find a dozen Warthog drivers discussing the day's training scenarios, their flight suits still damp with sweat from hours in the cockpit. Thompson looked up as she entered. Tanker 77, right? Rodriguez? Yes, sir. Captain Sarah Rodriguez. Take a seat, Captain. I wanted to get your perspective on some of the refueling challenges we encountered today. As Sarah settled into a chair at the back of the room, she became acutely aware that she was the only woman present and the only non-A10 pilot. The other pilots studied her with curious expressions, clearly wondering why a tanker driver had been invited to their debrief. Thompson continued. We had some difficulties with refueling operations and moderate turbulence. From your position as the tanker pilot, what did you observe? Sarah chose her words carefully, aware that she was essentially critiquing the flying skills of pilots who viewed themselves as elite warriors. Sir, from my perspective, the primary challenge seemed to be formation discipline in unstable air. The newer pilots were fighting the turbulence instead of anticipating it, which made precise positioning difficult. One of the younger A10 pilots, Captain Derek "Razor" Morrison, bristled at the implied criticism. Easy to Monday morning quarterback from the big, stable airplane, Captain. Try holding position in a Warthog sometime when you've got 30,000 pounds of thrust pushing you around. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Actually, sir, I'd welcome that opportunity. The A-10 was my first choice out of pilot training. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Thompson raised an eyebrow. Is that so? What happened? I was redirected. To tankers, sir. Apparently, there were concerns about my suitability for the A-10 mission. Morrison snorted. Can't imagine why. It's not like close air support is particularly demanding or anything. The sarcasm in Morrison's voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt the familiar frustration that had followed her since pilot training. Here was the same institutional bias, the same assumption that she couldn't handle the demands of combat aviation, dressed up as professional skepticism. Thompson studied Sarah with new interest. Rodriguez, what do you know about A-10 systems and tactics? More than most people would expect, sir. My father was a crew chief on A-10s for 15 years. I grew up around the aircraft, learned the systems, studied the tactics. I know the Warthog can take hits that would down any other aircraft. I understand the weapon systems, and I'm familiar with close air support procedures. Book knowledge is different from actually flying the mission, Morrison interjected. You can memorize all the technical manuals you want, but when you're diving through a cloud of flak with friendlies 50 meters from your target, theory goes out the window. Sarah felt her temper rising but kept her voice level. You're absolutely right, Captain. Which is why I'd like the opportunity to demonstrate that I can handle those situations, not just discuss them in a briefing room. Thompson looked around the room at his pilots, then back at Sarah. Tell you what, Rodriguez, we've got some simulator time available tomorrow afternoon. Why don't you come by and show us what you can do in a controlled environment? Consider it an academic exercise. Morrison leaned back in his chair with a smirk. This should be entertaining. Fair warning, Captain, the Warthog sim isn't calibrated for gentle flying. We run realistic combat scenarios with actual threat parameters. I wouldn't expect anything less, Sarah replied. As the debrief concluded and the pilots filtered out of the room, Thompson approached Sarah privately. Rodriguez, I want to be straight with you. My guys are the best close air support pilots in the Air Force, and they've earned the right to be protective of their community. They've all been shot. They've all saved lives, and they don't have much patience for people who want to play pilot for a day. Sir, I'm not looking to play anything. I'm looking for the opportunity to serve in the role I trained for. Thompson studied her for a moment. We'll see. But understand that tomorrow's session isn't just about flying skills. These guys are going to test your knowledge, your decision-making, and your ability to handle pressure. If you're not ready for that level of scrutiny, you might want to reconsider. I appreciate the warning, sir, but I've been dealing with scrutiny my entire career. I'm ready. As Sarah drove back to McConnell Air Force Base that evening, she realized that tomorrow's simulator session represented more than just a chance to fly an A-10. Even in simulation, it was an opportunity to prove that the institutional bias that had kept her out of the Warthog community was based on assumptions rather than reality. She spent that night reviewing A-10 technical manuals and tactical procedures, preparing for what she knew would be the most important flying evaluation of her career. The simulator might not be real combat, but for Sarah Rodriguez, it represented something equally significant: the chance to demonstrate that she belonged in the cockpit of the aircraft. She'd dreamed of flying since childhood. What Sarah didn't realize was that several of the A-10 pilots from the debrief had already decided she would fail, and they were prepared to design scenarios specifically intended to expose what they saw as her inevitable limitations. Tomorrow's simulator session wouldn't just be a test of her flying skills. It would be a trial by fire designed to prove their preconceptions correct. But Sarah Rodriguez had spent 2 years flying tankers with the precision and dedication that had made her one of the Air Force's most reliable pilots. She'd learned patience, she'd developed unshakable confidence in her abilities, and she'd inherited her father's stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The A-10 community was about to discover that their assumptions about who could handle the Warthog were about to be challenged by someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. The A-10 simulator facility at Nellis Air Force Base buzzed with anticipation the next afternoon as word spread through the squadron that a tanker pilot was going to attempt their combat scenarios. Sarah arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in a borrowed flight suit that Lieutenant Colonel Thompson had arranged, carrying a helmet bag that felt foreign after years of tanker operations. The simulator bay was more sophisticated than anything she'd trained on, with full motion capability and wraparound visual displays that could replicate any combat environment in the world. Captain Morrison was already there when she walked in, along with 3 other A-10 pilots she hadn't met the previous day. They stood clustered around the simulator control station, speaking in low voices that stopped abruptly when she entered. The atmosphere was charged with the kind of competitive tension she remembered from flight school, but this felt more personal, more pointed. Well, Morrison said, looking up from a mission planning sheet. Look who decided to show up. Hope you brought your A-game, Rodriguez, because we've prepared some special scenarios just for you. Sarah set down her helmet bag and approached the group calmly. I appreciate the opportunity, gentlemen. What's the plan for today's session? Major Kevin Psycho Walsh, a stocky pilot with close-cropped hair and intense eyes, stepped forward with a flight card in his hand. We're going to run you through 3 scenarios, each one progressively more challenging. First one's a simple close air support mission, troops in contact, standard 9-line briefing. Should be cake for someone with your alleged expertise. The condescension in Walsh's voice was unmistakable, but Sarah had learned years ago that the best response to skepticism was performance. Sounds reasonable. What's the threat environment? Light to moderate anti-aircraft artillery, some small arms fire, Morrison replied. Nothing you can't handle, right? After all, you've been studying this stuff your whole life. Captain Rick Venom Torres, a thin man with prematurely gray hair, pulled up the first scenario on the control station. Here's the situation. Army Rangers are pinned down by enemy forces in a compound about 12 clicks north of Kandahar. They need immediate close air support to break contact and withdraw to a safe extraction point. Friendly forces are marked. With infrared strobes, enemy positions are mixed in with civilian structures. Sarah studied the tactical display, noting the complex urban environment and the proximity of friendly and enemy forces. This wasn't a training scenario. It was a recreation of an actual combat mission, complete with all the moral and tactical complexities that made close air support one of the most demanding missions in military aviation. Time hack starts when you enter the target area, Walsh added. Rangers have been under fire for 40 minutes and are running low on ammunition. Every second you waste means American soldiers die. Sarah nodded and climbed into the simulator cockpit, the familiar smell of electronics and hydraulic fluid, triggering muscle memory from countless hours in various aircraft. The A-10 cockpit was different from the KC-135. More cramped, more focused, with every switch and display positioned for quick access during combat operations. But as she ran through the pre-flight checklist, years of studying technical manuals paid off. Her hands moved confidently across the instrument panel, activating systems in the correct sequence. Impressive, Torres muttered from the control station. She actually knows where everything is. Sarah ignored the comment and focused on the scenario briefing coming through her headset. The voice was computer-generated but realistic, providing the same 9-line close air support request that ground controllers used in actual combat. Target location, friendly positions, target description, elevation, ammunition restrictions, and attack heading. She copied the information quickly, already visualizing her approach to the target area. The simulation began with Sarah's A-10 approaching the target area at 15,000 feet, high enough to avoid most ground threats while maintaining clear visibility of the battlefield below. Through her targeting pod, she could see the Ranger's position marked by infrared strobes, surrounded by enemy muzzle flashes from multiple directions. The urban environment was a maze of buildings, alleyways, and civilian structures that required careful analysis before engaging any targets. Sarah's first pass was cautious and professional. She identified 3 enemy positions that posed immediate threats to the Rangers, marked them with her targeting system, and requested confirmation from the ground controller before engaging. Her GAU-8 cannon runs were precise, eliminating the enemy positions without causing collateral damage to nearby structures. Not bad, Morrison admitted grudgingly as Sarah completed her attack runs, but that was just the warm-up. Let's see how you handle something with a little more complexity. The second scenario was significantly more challenging. A multi-threat environment with surface-to-air missiles, coordinated enemy air defenses, and multiple friendly units operating in close proximity. Sarah found herself managing threats from multiple directions while providing close air support to 2 separate ground units simultaneously. The scenario required constant communication with ground controllers, airborne command and control aircraft, and other strike fighters operating in the same airspace. What impressed the watching pilots wasn't just Sarah's flying skills, but her ability to maintain situational awareness in the complex tactical environment. She prioritized targets based on immediate threat to friendly forces, coordinated her attacks with other aircraft to avoid fratricide, and managed her fuel and ammunition to remain effective throughout the extended engagement. She's actually pretty good at this, Torres whispered to Walsh as they watched Sarah execute a perfect strafing run that eliminated an enemy anti-aircraft position without damaging a nearby school. Walsh's expression remained skeptical. It's just a simulator, Rick. Let's see how she handles the real test. The third scenario was designed to break her. Morrison had programmed a recreation of one of the most challenging close air support missions from recent combat operations. A nighttime rescue mission in mountainous terrain, with severely degraded weather conditions, multiple surface-to-air missile threats, and friendly forces scattered across a valley under heavy enemy fire. The scenario included equipment malfunctions, communication failures, and split-second decisions that could mean the difference between saving lives and causing casualties. Sarah approached the final scenario with the same methodical precision she'd shown in the previous 2 missions. As her simulated A-10 entered the target area, she was immediately engaged by enemy missile systems that forced her to employ defensive countermeasures while maintaining focus on the ground tactical situation. Her primary radio failed halfway through the mission, forcing her to coordinate with ground controllers using backup systems while navigating through severe turbulence and limited visibility. The breakthrough moment came when the scenario presented Sarah with an impossible choice: 2 groups of friendly forces under fire simultaneously, separated by several kilometers, with ammunition and fuel limitations that made it impossible to save both groups using conventional tactics. This was the moment Morrison and Walsh expected her to crack, to make the kind of mistake that would vindicate their assumption that she wasn't ready for combat operations. Instead, Sarah did something that surprised everyone in the simulator bay. She requested immediate coordination with nearby artillery units and used her targeting systems to direct precise fire support to one group of friendlies while simultaneously attacking the enemies threatening the second group. It was a complex solution that required intimate knowledge of joint operations procedures and the confidence to coordinate multiple weapon systems in a compressed time frame. "Jesus Christ," Morrison muttered as he watched Sarah's solution unfold. "That's actually brilliant. I didn't even think about using artillery integration in that scenario." Sarah completed the mission with all friendly forces successfully extracted and all primary targets destroyed. Despite facing the most challenging combat scenario, the A-10 community used for training their most experienced pilots. As she climbed out of the simulator, her flight suit soaked with sweat from the stress and physical demands of the mission, she found 4 A-10 pilots staring at her with expressions she'd never seen before: genuine respect. Thompson, who had been watching silently from the back of the simulator bay, stepped forward as Sarah removed her helmet. "Rodriguez, that was some of the finest close air support flying I've seen in 20 years. Where the hell did you learn to integrate artillery fires with airstrikes like that?" "Sir, I spend a lot of time reading after-action reports from deployed units. I noticed that the most successful close air support missions used integrated fires whenever possible, so I studied the procedures." Torres shook his head in amazement. "You realize you just completed scenarios that we use to evaluate pilots for upgrade to flight lead positions? Most of our new guys would have flamed out on the second mission." Sarah looked around at the faces of pilots who had entered the simulator bay, convinced she would fail, and were now forced to confront the reality that their assumptions had been completely wrong. "Gentlemen, I appreciate the opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities. I hope this helps clarify any questions about my readiness for A-10 operations." Morrison, who had been the most vocal skeptic, approached Sarah with his hand extended. "Rodriguez, I owe you an apology. I came in here today expecting to watch you crash and burn, and instead you just schooled us on advanced tactics. That artillery integration idea is something we need to brief to the entire squadron." But even as the immediate mood in the simulator bay shifted toward acceptance, Sarah could see the larger challenge ahead of her. Impressing 4 pilots in a controlled environment was one thing. Gaining acceptance from an entire community that had systematically excluded women was another matter entirely. The real test wouldn't be in a simulator, but in the political and institutional barriers that had kept her out of the A-10 in the first place. As she packed her borrowed helmet and prepared to return to her tanker squadron, Sarah realized that today's success had opened a door, but walking through it would require navigating challenges that had nothing to do with flying skills and everything to do with changing minds that had been made up long before she ever set foot in an A-10 cockpit. Word of Sarah's simulator performance spread through the A-10 community with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Within 48 hours, pilots at bases from Arizona to South Carolina had heard about the tanker driver who'd executed advanced close air support scenarios that challenged even experienced Warthog pilots. But rather than opening doors, Sarah's demonstration of competence seemed to trigger a more sophisticated campaign of resistance from those who viewed her success as a threat to their exclusive brotherhood. The backlash began subtly, as institutional resistance always did. Colonel James Raptor Brennan, the commander of the 57th Wing at Nellis, received a series of informal visits from senior A-10 pilots over the following weeks. These weren't official complaints or formal objections, but rather concerned conversations about maintaining standards and preserving the unique culture that had made the A-10 community so effective in combat. Major General Patricia Hawkins, who oversaw pilot assignments for Air Combat Command, found herself fielding phone calls from influential voices within the close air support community. The conversations all followed similar patterns: acknowledgement that Captain Rodriguez had performed well in simulation, followed by carefully worded concerns about the difference between simulator performance and actual combat effectiveness, and concluding with subtle suggestions that integrating women into the A-10 community might create unnecessary complications during deployment cycles. Sarah became aware of this behind-the-scenes maneuvering when Lieutenant Colonel Thompson requested a private meeting at a coffee shop off base, away from the official channels and listening ears that permeated military installations. Thompson looked uncomfortable as he stirred his coffee, clearly struggling with information he felt obligated to share but wished he didn't possess. "Rodriguez, I'm going to be straight with you because I think you deserve to know what you're up against," Thompson began. "Your simulator performance was exceptional, and every pilot who witnessed it knows you've got the skills for the mission. But there are people in positions of authority who are working very hard to ensure you never get the opportunity to prove it in a real cockpit." Sarah had expected this conversation eventually, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a physical blow. "Sir, what specifically are they saying? If it's about my qualifications, I think the simulator results speak for themselves." Thompson shook his head grimly. "It's not about qualifications anymore, and that's what makes this so frustrating. They're raising concerns about unit cohesion, deployment logistics, physical requirements for combat operations, even suggesting that having women in A-10 squadrons would create distractions that could compromise mission effectiveness. Those are the same arguments they used to keep women out of combat roles for decades, sir. And they've been proven wrong in every other military occupation. I know that, and you know that, but the people making these decisions have spent their entire careers in a system where A-10 units were exclusively male. They're not necessarily bad people, Rodriguez, they're just scared of change, and they're using their positions to prevent something they don't understand." Thompson leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the civilian setting. "There's something else you need to know." Word came down from Air Combat Command that any requests for cross-training or aircraft transitions involving A-10 assignments are on indefinite hold pending a comprehensive review of community standards and operational requirements. Sarah felt her stomach sink. The bureaucratic language was deliberately vague, but its meaning was crystal clear. They were creating administrative barriers to prevent her from officially entering A-10 training, regardless of her demonstrated capabilities. "How long is indefinite, sir?" "Could be months, could be years. These reviews have a way of extending themselves when certain people want specific outcomes." As Sarah drove back to McConnell Air Force Base that evening, she wrestled with a frustration that went beyond personal disappointment. The military had invested considerable resources in her training, had benefited from her exceptional performance as a tanker pilot, and had witnessed her capabilities in A-10 simulation. Yet institutional bias was preventing the Air Force from utilizing her skills in the role where she could be most effective. The situation became more complicated when Sarah received an unexpected phone call from her father 3 days later. "Master, Sergeant Rodriguez's voice carried a tension she rarely heard, the careful tone of someone choosing words very deliberately. "Mia, I've been hearing things through the maintenance community that concern me. Apparently, some senior people are asking questions about your background, your motivations for pursuing the A-10, even suggestions that you might be more interested in making political statements than serving effectively. Dad, that's ridiculous. Everything I've done has been focused on becoming the best pilot possible. I know that, and anyone who's worked with you knows that. But politics in the military isn't always about truth, Sarah. Sometimes it's about perception. And there are people working very hard to create negative perceptions about your intentions." Miguel Rodriguez paused, and Sarah could hear the struggle in his voice between protecting his daughter and preparing her for reality. "There's something else. I've been told that some people are suggesting your simulator performance was somehow artificially enhanced, that the scenarios were modified to make you look better than you actually are. It's complete bullshit, but it's the kind of rumor that can stick if it gets repeated enough." Sarah felt anger rising in her chest, the kind of cold fury that came from being attacked not for her failures but for her successes. "Who's spreading these rumors, Dad?" "I can't give you names, but they're coming from people with enough rank to make them stick. The word I'm getting is that there's a coordinated effort to discredit your simulator performance and use it as evidence that you're not ready for real A-10 operations." That weekend, Sarah made a decision that would define the next phase of her career. Instead of waiting for bureaucratic reviews or hoping that institutional resistance would eventually fade, she would take control of her own narrative. She requested a meeting with Colonel Brennan, bypassing the normal chain of command and putting her concerns directly to the senior officer responsible for A-10 training at Nellis. Brennan's office was decorated with the memorabilia of a career spent in fighter aircraft. From his early days flying F-4 Phantoms through multiple combat deployments in A-10s, he was a respected pilot and a fair leader, but he was also a product of a military culture that had never included women in close air support roles. "Captain Rodriguez," Brennan said as she entered his office, "I understand you wanted to discuss your career progression. I have to tell you upfront that my options are limited by current policy reviews." Sarah had prepared for this conversation carefully, knowing that she would have only one opportunity to make her case directly to the decision-maker. "Sir, I'm not here to complain about policies or to request special consideration. I'm here to address what I believe are misconceptions about my qualifications and motivations that may be influencing decisions about my career." Brennan gestured for her to sit, his expression neutral but attentive. "Sir, I've heard suggestions that my simulator performance was somehow artificially enhanced, or that my interest in A-10 operations is motivated by something other than a genuine desire to serve effectively in that role. I'd like to address those concerns directly." Sarah spent the next 20 minutes methodically dismantling every argument that had been raised against her assignment to A-10 training. She provided documentation of her academic performance, references from her current commanders attesting to her professionalism and effectiveness, and detailed analysis of her simulator results that demonstrated her tactical knowledge and decision-making abilities. Brennan listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts on her presentation. "Captain, I appreciate your thoroughness, and I want you to know that I've reviewed your records personally. Your qualifications are impressive, and your simulator performance was genuinely exceptional." Sarah felt a moment of hope, but Brennan's tone suggested more was coming. "However, the concerns being raised aren't primarily about your individual capabilities. They're about the broader implications of integrating women into A-10 operations, particularly in deployed environments where units operate under extreme stress for extended periods. Sir, respectfully, those same concerns have been raised about every military occupation that's been open to women, from combat support roles to fighter pilots to ground combat units. In every case, the integration has been successful when it's been based on individual qualifications rather than gender-based assumptions. Brennan leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with the expression of someone wrestling with competing priorities. Rodriguez, off the record, I believe you have the skills to be an effective A-10 pilot. But on the record, I have to consider the impact of policy changes on unit effectiveness, community cohesion, and operational readiness. Those are factors that go beyond individual performance. As Sarah left Brennan's office, she realized that her battle wasn't really about flying skills or tactical knowledge anymore. It was about changing institutional cultures that had been decades in the making, and that level of change would require more than impressive simulator scores or rational arguments. The real test would come when circumstances forced the A-10 community to choose between their preconceptions and their mission requirements. And Sarah Rodriguez would have to be ready when that moment arrived. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a crisis that had nothing to do with gender politics or institutional resistance. Sarah was sitting in the McConnell Air Force Base Operations Center during a routine night shift when the secure phone rang with an urgency that immediately commanded attention. Major Lisa Garrett, the operations officer, answered with the crisp professionalism that characterized all military communications, but her expression grew increasingly grave as she listened to the voice on the other end. Roger, understand. Will have aircraft and crews ready within the hour, Garrett said before hanging up and immediately reaching for the squadron alert roster. Sarah watched as Garrett began making rapid phone calls, her tone shifting to the controlled urgency that signaled a real-world emergency rather than a training exercise. Within minutes, the operations center transformed from its normal quiet efficiency into a hub of coordinated activity as personnel began arriving from their quarters and off-duty locations. Rodriguez, Garrett called out as she reviewed crew assignments. I need you to stand by as primary backup for the deployment package. We've got a situation developing in the Horn of Africa that's going to require immediate tanker support for extended operations. The briefing that followed painted a picture of an escalating crisis in the remote regions of Somalia, where a joint international peacekeeping force had been ambushed while attempting to deliver humanitarian aid to displaced civilians. Multiple units were scattered across difficult terrain, some cut off from resupply and facing determined enemy forces that had been planning this operation for months. What made the situation particularly complex was the geography involved. The scattered friendly forces were operating in mountainous terrain that limited the effectiveness of traditional close air support aircraft, while the distance from established bases meant that any air support would require extensive aerial refueling to remain on station long enough to be useful. The initial deployment package included 2 A-10 squadrons from different bases, multiple tanker aircraft for refueling support, and command and control assets to coordinate the complex operation. Sarah's role was to serve as backup crew for one of the KC-135 aircraft, ready to deploy if primary crews became unavailable due to crew rest requirements or mechanical issues. As the deployment preparations intensified over the following 48 hours, Sarah found herself increasingly involved in mission planning despite her backup status. Her experience with aerial refueling operations in challenging environments made her input valuable for determining optimal refueling tracks and coordinating with the A-10 units that would depend on her aircraft for extended operations. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. It was during one of these planning sessions that Sarah first encountered Colonel Michael Sledge Anderson, the commander of the 355th Fighter Squadron from Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. Anderson was a legend in the A-10 community, with over 3,000 combat hours and a reputation for tactical innovation that had saved Countless ground troops over multiple deployments, Anderson studied the mission planning materials with the intense focus that characterized experienced combat pilots. But Sarah noticed that he seemed particularly concerned about the refueling requirements for the extended operations they were planning. "The problem isn't getting to the target area," Anderson explained to the assembled planners. "It's staying there long enough to be effective. These scattered ground units are going to need continuous air support for potentially days, not hours. That means we need tanker operations that can sustain multiple A-10s on station simultaneously while managing fuel flow for aircraft that might be taking battle damage." Sarah had been listening quietly, but Anderson's description of the refueling challenges aligned perfectly with scenarios she'd studied and practiced during her tanker training. She raised her hand tentatively, aware that as a backup crew member, her input might not be welcome in the senior-level planning session. "Sir, if I may, there are some formation refueling techniques that might address those sustainability requirements." Anderson looked at her with the sharp attention that combat veterans reserve for information that might affect mission success. "Go ahead, Captain." Sarah moved to the tactical display and began outlining a refueling concept that involved multiple tankers operating in coordinated patterns, allowing A-10s to cycle through refueling operations without leaving the target area undefended. "The key is positioning the tankers so that aircraft can refuel individually while others maintain overwatch of ground forces. It requires precise timing and communication, but it would allow continuous close air support coverage even during extended operations." Anderson studied the concept Sarah had outlined, his expression shifting from polite attention to genuine interest as he recognized the tactical advantages of her approach. "Rodriguez, right?" Anderson said, reading her name. "Tape, where did you learn formation refueling techniques like this?" "Sir, I've been flying tankers for 2 years, and I've studied every available resource on aerial refueling tactics. This particular concept is adapted from techniques used during extended operations in Afghanistan." Anderson nodded slowly, clearly, impressed by Sarah's knowledge of tactical refueling operations. "Have you actually executed formations of this complex in real operations?" "Yes, sir. Not in combat, but I've led formation refueling exercises that included multiple receiver aircraft and coordinated timing sequences. The principles are the same." What Sarah didn't expect was Anderson's next question, which would change the trajectory of her entire career. "Rodriguez, what's your background with A-10 operations? You seem to understand the tactical requirements better than most tanker pilots I've worked with." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized this was potentially the opportunity she'd been preparing for since her first day in the Air Force. "Sir, the A-10 was my first choice out of pilot training. I've studied the aircraft systems and tactics extensively, and I recently completed advanced simulation training at Nellis." Anderson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Simulation training? What kind of scenarios?" Before Sarah could respond, Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, spoke up. "Colonel Anderson, Captain Rodriguez completed our most advanced close air support scenarios with exceptional results. She demonstrated tactical knowledge and decision-making abilities that impressed our entire evaluation team." Anderson looked between Thompson and Sarah, clearly processing implications that extended beyond the immediate mission planning session. "Thompson, are you telling me we have a tanker pilot who's qualified to fly A-10 close air support missions?" "Sir, she's not formally qualified because she hasn't completed the official training program, but her demonstrated abilities suggest she could be effective in that role with minimal additional preparation." Anderson was quiet for a long moment, studying the mission requirements displayed on the tactical screen, then looking back at Sarah with the expression of a commander weighing operational needs against institutional protocols. "Rodriguez, this deployment is going to require maximum flexibility from all our aircrew. We're going to be operating in an environment where traditional role distinctions might become less important than individual capabilities. Sarah understood immediately what Anderson was suggesting, and she felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension at the implications. "Sir, I'm prepared to serve in whatever capacity the mission requires." Anderson nodded, then addressed the room more broadly. "I want Rodriguez included in all tactical planning sessions for this deployment. Her understanding of both tanker operations and close air support tactics could be valuable for coordinating complex missions." As the planning session concluded, and personnel began dispersing to their various preparation tasks, Anderson approached Sarah privately. "Captain, I want to be clear about something. This deployment is going to be dangerous, complex, and politically sensitive. If you're going to be involved in tactical planning, you need to understand that you might be called upon to perform beyond your officially assigned role." Sarah met Anderson's gaze directly, recognizing the weight of what he was suggesting. "Sir, I understand and I'm ready for whatever the mission requires." "Good, because based on what I'm seeing in these intelligence reports, we're going to need every qualified pilot we can get, regardless of what aircraft they're currently assigned to fly." As Sarah left the planning session, she realized that the institutional barriers that had kept her out of A-10 operations might be about to become irrelevant in the face of operational necessity. The crisis developing in the Horn of Africa was creating circumstances where competence would matter more than bureaucratic policies, and she would finally have the opportunity to prove herself in the role she'd trained for her entire career. She didn't yet know was that within 72 hours, she would be sitting in the cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt II, flying toward a valley where 285 Marines were fighting for their lives, and that her performance in that moment would change not just her own career, but the entire conversation about women in combat aviation. The phone call that would set everything in motion was still 2 days away. But Sarah Rodriguez was already preparing for the moment when theory would become reality and when all the arguments about her capabilities would be settled by the ultimate test, actual combat operations where lives hung in the balance. The call came at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, jolting Sarah from the restless sleep that had become routine since the deployment preparations began. The voice on the secure line belonged to Colonel Anderson, but the controlled urgency in his tone immediately told her this wasn't a drill or routine update. "Rodriguez, we need you at the operations center immediately. Full flight gear. We've got a situation that's gone from bad to catastrophic in the last 6 hours." Sarah was dressed and moving within minutes, her mind racing through the possibilities. As she drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward the base, the operations center was blazing with activity when she arrived. Multiple screens displaying real-time intelligence feeds and tactical overlays that painted a grim picture of the developing crisis. Major Garrett briefed her quickly as she suited up. Marine Expeditionary Unit conducting humanitarian operations in the Bakul region got hit by a coordinated ambush 3 hours ago. Multiple companies scattered across a valley system, heavy casualties, and they're completely cut off from extraction routes. The tactical display showed the brutal reality of the situation. 285 Marines were trapped in defensive positions throughout a valley surrounded by high ridgelines that enemy forces had occupied with heavy weapons and anti-aircraft systems. The terrain made helicopter extraction impossible, and ground reinforcement would take days to organize and execute. "Sir, what's our mission?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Anderson stepped forward, his expression grim. "Primary A-10 Squadron has been flying continuous missions for 18 hours. We've lost 2 aircraft to mechanical failures, 1 pilot's down with appendicitis, and the remaining crews are approaching mandatory crew rest limits. Meanwhile, those Marines are getting hammered by coordinated mortar attacks that are going to kill them all if we can't provide continuous close air support." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized where this briefing was heading. "Rodriguez, I need a pilot who can fly an 8-hour close air support mission in the most challenging tactical environment we've seen in years. Someone who understands both the tactical requirements and the refueling coordination necessary to stay on station. Someone who studied A-10 systems and procedures extensively. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Anderson was asking her to fly a combat mission in an aircraft she'd never officially been trained on, in conditions that would challenge even experienced Warthog pilots. "Sir, I need to be clear about my qualifications. I've never actually flown." And at 10 outside of simulation, Anderson nodded grimly. "I know that. But you've demonstrated tactical knowledge that exceeds some of our experienced pilots. And right now, tactical knowledge might be more important than stick time. Those Marines don't care about your official qualifications. They care about staying alive until we can get them out of that valley." Thompson stepped forward with additional details that made the mission's complexity clear. "Sarah, this isn't going to be a standard close air support mission. The enemy has positioned anti-aircraft systems that limit our operating altitude. The valley floor is covered with fog that restricts visibility, and friendly forces are scattered in positions that require precision strikes within danger close distances." Sarah understood immediately that this was the moment her entire career had been building toward. All the studying, all the simulator time, all the preparation was about to be tested in the most unforgiving environment possible. Actual combat with American lives hanging in the balance. "Sir, what about official authorization for me to fly?" "The mission?" Anderson's expression was stone-cold serious. "Rodriguez, in about 2 hours, I'm going to have 285 dead Marines on my conscience if I don't get effective close air support over that valley. The bureaucrats can sort out the paperwork later, but right now, I need the best pilot available for this mission, and based on everything I've seen, that's you." The next hour was a blur of intense preparation. Sarah received a rapid briefing on the specific A-10 aircraft she would be flying, including any mechanical quirks or system modifications that differed from the standard configuration she'd studied. The weapons load was complex, a mix of precision-guided munitions for specific targets and the GAU-8 cannon for close support of troops in contact. The intelligence picture was sobering. Enemy forces had spent weeks preparing this ambush, positioning heavy weapons in caves and fortified positions throughout the ridgeline surrounding the valley. They had surface-to-air missiles, coordinated mortar teams, and enough ammunition to sustain operations for days. Most concerning was their tactical sophistication. They were using the terrain expertly and had demonstrated the ability to coordinate complex attacks across multiple positions simultaneously. As Sarah conducted her pre-flight inspection of the A-10, she was struck by how familiar everything felt despite never having touched an actual Warthog before. Years of studying technical manuals and her father's detailed explanations had prepared her for this moment more thoroughly than she'd realized. Her hands moved confidently across the aircraft systems, checking hydraulics, weapons configurations, and avionics with the efficiency of an experienced pilot. The radio crackled with updates from the valley as she completed her pre-flight procedures. The Marines were holding their positions, but ammunition was running low and casualties were mounting. Every minute of delay increased the likelihood that the defensive perimeter would collapse under the sustained enemy attacks. "Viper 1, this is Hammer Control," came the voice of the airborne command aircraft that would coordinate her mission. "Be advised, we've got multiple surface-to-air threats active in your target area. Recommend staying above 8,000 feet minimum altitude for initial assessment." Sarah acknowledged the warning as she taxied toward the runway, her heart rate elevated but her hands steady on the controls. The A-10's engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and she felt the aircraft's powerful response to her inputs. Despite the high-stakes nature of the mission, there was something deeply satisfying about finally sitting in the cockpit of the aircraft. She'd dreamed of flying since childhood. As she lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah's radio filled with communications from multiple sources: the airborne controller providing tactical updates, the Marine ground commander reporting enemy positions, and other aircraft in the area coordinating deconfliction procedures. The complexity of managing multiple information sources while flying toward a combat zone would have been overwhelming for a less prepared pilot, but Sarah's years of training in high workload environments served her well. 40 minutes into the Code A flight, as she approached the target area, the radio crackled with an update that changed everything. Viper 1, Hammer Control. Be advised, enemy forces have begun a coordinated assault on Marine positions throughout the valley. We're seeing heavy mortar fire, coordinated ground attacks, and what appears to be a final push to overrun defensive positions. Marines are requesting immediate close air support, danger close, multiple targets. Sarah looked ahead toward the valley where 285 Americans were fighting for their lives, knowing that her performance in the next few hours would determine whether they lived or died. The institutional barriers that had kept her out of A-10 cockpits, the skepticism about her capabilities, the bureaucratic reviews and political maneuvering, all of that was irrelevant now. What mattered was her ability to fly precision attack missions in a hostile environment, to make split-second decisions under fire, and to provide the kind of close air support that would allow those Marines to survive until extraction could be arranged. As the valley came into view through her targeting systems, Sarah Rodriguez realized that she was about to prove everything she'd claimed about her capabilities, not in a comfortable simulator or a controlled training environment, but in actual combat where mistakes meant death and success meant salvation. The radio crackled again. Viper 1, we have troops in contact. Immediate assistance required. How to copy? Sarah keyed her microphone and responded with the confidence that had carried her through every challenge of her military career. Hammer Control, Viper 1 copies. Inbound hot, ready to engage. Sarah's first glimpse of the valley revealed a scene from hell. Through her targeting pod, she could see muzzle flashes scattered across the ridgelines like deadly stars, while smoke and dust clouds marked the impact. Points of enemy mortar raining down on the Marine positions below. The fog that Thompson had warned her about clung to the valley floor, reducing visibility and making target identification infinitely more challenging. Viper 1, this is Reaper 6, came the voice of the Marine ground commander, his transmission punctuated by the sound of explosions in the background. We've got enemy positions on the North Ridge. Engage in our eastern perimeter with heavy machine guns and RPGs. Friendly positions marked by infrared strobes. Enemy targets approximately 200 meters north of our location. Sarah studied the tactical display on her multifunction screen, correlating the ground commander's verbal description with what she could observe through her sensors. The proximity of friendly and enemy forces was closer than anything she'd encountered in simulation, requiring precision that left no margin for error. Reaper 6, Viper 1 has eyes on your strobes. I'm seeing multiple enemy positions along the ridgeline. Be advised, I'm going to need you to mark your northernmost positions with additional strobes to ensure positive identification before I engage. Roger, Viper 1. Stand by for additional markings. As Sarah waited for the Marines to position their identification markers, she used the time to analyze the broader tactical situation. Enemy forces were positioned in a coordinated pattern that suggested professional military training rather than the irregular tactics typically associated with insurgent groups. They had established interlocking fields of fire, coordinated their attacks to pressure multiple Marine positions simultaneously, and positioned anti-aircraft weapons to deny air support. The first surface-to-air missile launch came without warning. A streak of light rising from a concealed position on the western ridge. Sarah's threat warning system screamed as she deployed countermeasures and maneuvered aggressively to defeat the incoming missile. The proximity of the launch confirmed what intelligence had suggested. This wasn't a hastily organized ambush, but a carefully planned operation designed to destroy the Marine unit completely. Viper 1, SAM launched from the West Ridge. Sarah transmitted as she continued evasive maneuvers. Be advised, we have coordinated air defense systems active throughout the target area. Copy, Viper 1, responded the airborne controller. Other aircraft in the area are reporting multiple SAM sites. Recommend variable altitude and approach patterns to complicate enemy targeting. Sarah acknowledged the warning and began her first attack run, diving toward the northern ridge where Marine positions were taking heavy casualties from enemy machine gun nests. Through her targeting pod, she could see the thermal signatures of enemy fighters positioned behind fortified positions, their weapons cycling rapidly as they poured fire down into the valley. Her first burst from the A-10 cannon was devastatingly accurate. The 30mm depleted uranium rounds tore through the enemy position with precision that eliminated the immediate threat while avoiding any damage to Marine positions just meters away. The distinctive sound of the Warthog's cannon echoed through the valley, a sound that every Marine had been trained to recognize as salvation arriving from above. Viper 1, Reaper 6, outstanding shooting. That position was chewing us up. We've got another heavy weapons position on the South Ridge that's been dropping mortar on our casualty collection point. Sarah immediately shifted her attention to the Southern Ridge, scanning through her targeting systems for the mortar position that posed a direct threat to wounded Marines. The challenge was that mortar teams were mobile and often fired from positions that provided protection from air attack, making them difficult targets that required patient observation and precise timing. Reaper 6, I'm not immediately seeing the mortar position on the South Ridge. Can you give me a more specific location relative to terrain features? Viper 1, they're firing from a cave system approximately halfway up the ridge, about 300 meters southwest of the large rock outcropping. We've been taking indirect fire from that position for the last 2 hours. Sarah studied the terrain carefully, using her sensors to identify the rock outcropping the Marine commander had referenced. Cave systems were particularly challenging targets because they provided natural protection from airstrikes, often requiring specialized munitions or creative attack angles to neutralize effectively. As she maneuvered to get a better view of the suspected mortar position, Sarah's aircraft was bracketed by anti-aircraft fire from multiple directions. Tracer rounds streaked past her cockpit as enemy gunners tried to track her movement, forcing her to vary her flight path constantly while maintaining focus on target identification. The breakthrough came when she observed the brief thermal signature of a mortar tube being fired from within the cave system. The muzzle flash was visible for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to confirm the exact location of the enemy position. Reaper 6, Viper 1 has positive identification on the mortar position. I'm going to engage with precision munitions to minimize collateral damage to the cave system. Sarah selected a small diameter precision-guided munition from her weapons inventory, programmed the targeting coordinates, and initiated her attack run. The weapons guidance system locked onto the cave entrance with electronic precision, and she released it at the optimal point to ensure accurate delivery. Despite the challenging target geometry, the explosion was contained within the cave system, eliminating the mortar threat without causing the kind of secondary explosions that might indicate civilian casualties or unintended destruction. Through her targeting pod, Sarah could see that the immediate area around the cave entrance was clear of friendly forces, confirming that her precision had been sufficient to avoid fratricidal damage. Viper 1, Reaper 6, direct hit on the mortar position. Outstanding work. That takes a lot of pressure off our casualty collection point. But even as Sarah celebrated the successful engagement, her situational awareness warned her of a developing crisis elsewhere in the valley. Radio transmissions from multiple Marine units indicated that enemy forces were beginning a coordinated ground assault, moving down from the ridgelines toward the scattered defensive positions in what appeared to be a final push to overrun the Marines before additional support could arrive. "All stations, this is Reaper 6, came the increasingly urgent voice of the ground commander. Enemy forces are advancing on multiple positions simultaneously. We're seeing coordinated movement from north, south, and west ridges. This looks like their main assault." Sarah's tactical display suddenly filled with multiple target requests as Marine units throughout the valley called for immediate close air support. The enemy assault was sophisticated and well coordinated, with different groups advancing along covered routes that provided mutual support while minimizing their exposure to air attack. "Viper 1, we need immediate support on the eastern perimeter," transmitted one Marine unit leader. "We've got approximately 30 enemy fighters advancing through the tree line, and we're running low on ammunition." Simultaneously, another transmission crackled through. "Viper 1, this is Bravo Company. We've got enemy forces moving through the ravine system toward our southern positions. We need danger close fire support immediately." Sarah found herself facing the exact scenario that had been designed to break pilots in her simulator training. Multiple units under simultaneous attack, limited ammunition and fuel, and tactical decisions that required split-second timing to prevent catastrophic casualties. The difference was that this time, the Marines calling for help weren't computer simulations. They were real American servicemen whose lives depended entirely on her ability to prioritize targets, manage her weapons systems efficiently, and execute precision strikes under the most challenging conditions possible. As Sarah maneuvered her A-10 to engage the first wave of advancing enemy forces, she realized that everything she'd trained for, everything she'd studied, and everything she'd prepared for was about to be tested in the crucible of actual combat, where there were no second chances and no opportunities for mistakes. The next hour would determine whether 285 Marines lived or died, and whether Sarah Rodriguez would prove once and for all that she belonged in the cockpit of the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Sarah's response to the coordinated enemy assault was a masterpiece of tactical aviation that would later be studied in military academies worldwide. Rather than attempting to engage multiple targets sequentially, she implemented a precision attack pattern that maximized the psychological impact of her presence, while systematically destroying the enemy's ability to coordinate their offensive operations. Her first target was the enemy command element that she'd identified through careful observation of their communication patterns and movement coordination. Using her targeting pod, Sarah had noticed that one group of fighters on the northern ridge was directing the movements of other units through hand signals and radio communications. Eliminating this command structure would disrupt the entire assault. Reaper 6, Viper 1, is engaging enemy command elements on the northern ridge. Recommend all units maintain current positions and prepare for immediate follow-up strikes. Sarah's attack run took her directly through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire, but her approach angle and timing were calculated to minimize her exposure while maximizing the effectiveness of her weapons delivery. The GAU-8 cannon erupted with its distinctive roar, sending a stream of 30mm rounds that eliminated the enemy command position in a devastating display of precision firepower. The psychological effect was immediate and dramatic. Enemy forces throughout the valley could hear the distinctive sound of the Warthog's cannon, and they understood that their coordinated assault was now under attack from above. The loss of their command element created confusion and hesitation in their previously coordinated movements. "Viper 1, this is Bravo Company," transmitted the Marine unit under attack from the ravine system. "Enemy advance has slowed significantly after your last strike. We can see them taking cover and breaking off their assault." But Sarah wasn't finished. She had identified a critical vulnerability in the enemy's positioning that could turn their tactical advantage into a catastrophic disadvantage. The ravine system that enemy forces were using for concealed movement was actually a natural killing ground if approached from the correct angle. Reaper 6, Viper 1 has identified a high-value target opportunity in the southern ravine system. I can engage multiple enemy positions simultaneously, but I need all friendly forces to maintain strict position discipline during my attack run. Sarah's plan was audacious and required precision that bordered on the impossible. She would attack the ravine system from an angle that would allow her cannon fire to follow the natural contours of the terrain, effectively turning the enemy's protected route into a trap, where they had no escape from her weapons. The attack run required Sarah to fly at an altitude that put her well within range of enemy small arms fire, but the tactical opportunity was too valuable to ignore. As she dove toward the ravine system, tracer rounds streaked past her cockpit while her targeting systems locked onto the enemy formations moving through the narrow terrain feature. The GAU-8 cannon spoke again, its rounds following the ravine's path with surgical precision. Enemy fighters caught in the confined space had nowhere to maneuver, and Sarah's attack eliminated an entire assault element in a single devastating pass. The tactical situation in the valley shifted dramatically as the enemy's southern assault collapsed completely. Viper 1, Bravo Company, that was incredible. You just eliminated the entire enemy force advancing on our position. Outstanding shooting. As Sarah pulled out of her attack dive, she noticed something that would prove crucial to the overall success of the mission. The enemy's coordinated assault had been broken, but scattered groups were now attempting to withdraw to predetermined rally points on the surrounding ridgelines. If these forces were allowed to regroup and reorganize, they could launch another assault within hours. Hammer control. Viper 1. I'm observing enemy withdrawal patterns that suggest predetermined rally points on the western ridge. Recommend immediate engagement to prevent enemy reorganization. Copy, Viper 1. You are cleared to engage retreating enemy forces. Be advised, other aircraft are inbound to provide additional support, but you remain primarily on station for the next 2 hours. Sarah's pursuit of the withdrawing enemy forces required her to fly close to the ridgelines where anti-aircraft weapons were still active. Her aircraft took several hits from small arms fire, but the A-10's legendary durability allowed her to continue operations despite minor damage to non-critical systems. The Western Ridge engagement was a running battle that lasted nearly an hour as Sarah systematically eliminated enemy positions while they attempted to establish new defensive positions. Her ammunition management was critical. She had to balance the immediate need to prevent enemy reorganization against the requirement to maintain weapons reserves for potential future threats. Viper 1, this is Reaper 6. We're observing significant enemy movement toward the northwestern exit from the valley. It looks like they're attempting a coordinated withdrawal, but they're still carrying heavy weapons that could threaten follow-on operations. Sarah studied the tactical display and realized that the enemy withdrawal route passed through a narrow canyon that created another tactical opportunity. If she could position herself correctly, she could interdict the withdrawal and eliminate the heavy weapons that posed a continuing threat to marine operations. The canyon engagement required Sarah to fly between steep rock walls that limited her maneuvering options, while enemy forces below attempted to shoot down her aircraft with everything from small arms to rocket-propelled grenades. The confined space amplified the sound of her engines and weapons, creating a psychological effect that added to the enemy's panic and confusion. Her final major engagement of the mission was a textbook demonstration of close air support tactics. Enemy forces had established a hasty defensive position at the canyon's exit, using heavy machine guns and mortar to cover their withdrawal. Sarah's attack eliminated this position with a combination of precision munitions and cannon fire that cleared the way for follow-on operations while ensuring that enemy forces could not re-establish a threat to Marine positions. Viper 1, Hammer Control, Outstanding Mission Execution. Ground forces report all immediate threats neutralized, casualty. Evacuation is proceeding, and extraction operations can commence. As Sarah began her transit back to base, her radio filled with transmissions from the Marines she had supported. The gratitude in their voices was unmistakable, but more importantly, their professional assessment of her performance left no doubt about her effectiveness in the close air support role. Viper 1, this is Reaper 6. I've been in the Corps for 18 years, and I've never seen close air support executed with that level of precision and tactical awareness. You saved a lot of lives today, and every Marine in this valley knows it. Similar transmissions came from other Marine unit leaders throughout the valley, each acknowledging not just her technical proficiency, but her understanding of ground tactics, and her ability to make decisions that prioritize their survival over her own safety. The flight back to base gave Sarah time to process what had just occurred. She had flown her first combat mission in an A-10, under conditions that would have challenged the most experienced pilots, and had achieved results that exceeded every expectation. The institutional barriers that had kept her out of the Warthog community seemed insignificant compared to the reality of her combat performance. As her aircraft touched down and she completed the post-flight procedures, Sarah knew that everything had changed. The debate about her qualifications was over, settled not by bureaucratic reviews or political considerations, but by her actions under fire. She had proven in the most definitive way possible that she belonged in the cockpit of the A-10 Thunderbolt II. What she didn't yet realize was that news of her mission was already spreading through military channels, and that her performance would force a complete reevaluation of policies that had excluded women from close air support roles. The 285 Marines she had saved would become advocates for her capabilities, and their testimony would carry weight that no amount of institutional resistance could overcome. The debriefing room at the forward operating base buzzed with an energy Sarah had never experienced before. Instead of the skeptical faces and grudging acknowledgments she'd grown accustomed to, she found herself surrounded by combat veterans whose expressions carried genuine respect and professional admiration. Colonel Anderson sat at the head of the table, but the real authority in the room came from the Marine officers who had flown in specifically to participate in the mission debrief. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Bull Sullivan, the Marine ground commander, who had coordinated with Sarah throughout the 8-hour mission, spoke first. His uniform still bore the dust and grime of the valley engagement, and his voice carried the hoarse exhaustion of someone who had spent hours directing life-or-death operations under fire. Captain Rodriguez, I need to state for the record that your performance today represents the finest close air support I've witnessed in 22 years of Marine Corps service. Your tactical awareness, precision weapons delivery, and ability to adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions saved the lives of every Marine in that valley. The formal language couldn't disguise the emotion in Sullivan's voice as he continued. More specifically, your identification and elimination of the enemy command structure broke their coordinated assault at exactly the moment when our defensive positions were becoming untenable. Without that intervention, we would have been overrun within the hour. Major Rebecca Hayes, the Marine intelligence officer who had been monitoring the engagement from the Tactical Operations Center, provided additional context that highlighted the sophistication of Sarah's tactical decisions. Captain, your analysis of enemy withdrawal patterns and your decision to interdict their rally points prevented what could have been a follow-on attack within 6 hours. Intelligence intercepts confirmed that enemy forces were planning exactly that scenario, but it was the testimony of the individual Marine unit leaders that carried the most weight. Captain James Riot Morrison, whose company had been under direct assault when Sarah arrived, stood to address the room with the formality that Marines reserved for the most serious occasions. Ma'am, I commanded Bravo Company during the engagement, And I can tell you that my Marines were convinced we were going to die in that valley. We'd been under sustained attack for over 12 hours. We were running low on ammunition, and medevac was impossible due to the enemy air defense systems. Morrison paused, clearly struggling with the emotion of recounting the experience. When we heard that distinctive sound of the A-10's cannon, it was like hearing the voice of God. But what made the difference wasn't just the firepower. It was your understanding of our tactical situation and your ability to provide exactly the kind of support we needed, exactly when we needed it. The debriefing continued for 3 hours as Sarah provided detailed accounts of her decision-making process, target selection criteria, and tactical assessments. What became clear to everyone in the room was that her performance hadn't been lucky or instinctive. It had been the result of years of systematic study and preparation that had prepared her for exactly these kinds of complex scenarios. Colonel Anderson, who had taken a significant career risk by authorizing Sarah to fly the mission, found his decision validated beyond his most optimistic expectations. Rodriguez, I want you to understand that what you accomplished today goes far beyond individual achievement. You've demonstrated capabilities that are going to change how we think about pilot assignments and qualifications throughout the air force. The implications of Anderson's statement became clear over the following days as word of Sarah's mission spread through military channels with unprecedented speed. The combat effectiveness she had demonstrated couldn't be dismissed as simulator performance or training exercise results. This was documented combat performance with verifiable outcomes and witness testimony from multiple sources. General Patricia Hawkins, the same Air Combat Command officer who had been receiving calls questioning Sarah's qualifications just weeks earlier, now found herself fielding a very different kind of communication. The Marine Corps' Commandant's office had submitted a formal commendation request, specifically citing Sarah's performance as exemplary of the kind of close air support that saved Marine lives in combat. The bureaucratic machinery that had been working to prevent Sarah's assignment to A-10 operations suddenly found itself confronted with undeniable evidence that their assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. The institutional resistance that had seemed so powerful just days earlier evaporated in the face of combat results that spoke louder than any policy memorandum or cultural tradition. Major General Kevin Hawk Thompson, commander of the Air Force's Close Air Support Community, requested a personal meeting with Sarah within 48 hours of her return from the mission. Thompson was a legend in A-10 circles, with over 4,000 combat hours and a reputation for tactical innovation that had influenced an entire generation of pilots. Captain Rodriguez, Thompson said as she entered his office, I've spent the last 2 days reviewing every aspect of your mission, talking to the Marines you supported, and analyzing your tactical decisions. I need to tell you something that I've never said to another pilot in 30 years of military service. Sarah waited, unsure of what to expect from this conversation with one of the Air Force's most respected combat commanders. Your performance in that valley represents a level of tactical excellence that we use as the standard for evaluating our most experienced pilots. The fact that you achieved those results on your first combat mission in an aircraft you'd never officially flown suggests capabilities that we need to understand and replicate throughout our community. Thompson leaned forward, his expression serious. More importantly, the Marines you saved are now telling everyone who will listen that you're the most effective close air support pilot they've ever worked with. That kind of testimony from ground forces carries more weight than any evaluation or policy review. The conversation that followed would reshape Sarah's career and influence Air Force policies for decades to come. Thompson offered her immediate assignment to the premier A-10 squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, with accelerated progression to flight lead and instructor pilot positions based on her demonstrated combat effectiveness. Sir, I'm honored by the offer, but I need to understand something, Sarah replied. Just weeks ago, I was being told that A-10 operations weren't suitable for women, that unit cohesion would suffer, that there were physical and cultural barriers that couldn't be overcome. What's changed? Thompson's answer was direct and uncompromising. What's changed is that 285 Marines are alive today because you proved all those arguments wrong. Combat effectiveness is the only standard that matters. In military aviation, and you've demonstrated combat effectiveness at the highest level. The formal orders transferring Sarah to A-10 operations arrived within a week, but the real change was already evident in the attitudes and responses of the pilots who had once questioned her qualifications. Captain Morrison, who had initially mocked her simulator performance, requested a personal meeting to offer both an apology and a request to serve under her command. "Captain Rodriguez, I was wrong about you in every possible way," Morrison said. "I let preconceptions blind me to your actual capabilities, and I want you to know that if you'll have me, I'd be honored to fly as your wingman." Similar conversations occurred throughout the A-10 community as pilots who had participated in the institutional resistance found themselves confronted with the undeniable reality of Sarah's combat performance. The arguments about physical limitations, unit cohesion, and cultural compatibility seemed irrelevant when measured against the testimony of Marines whose lives she had saved. The transformation was so complete and so rapid that it surprised even Sarah. Within a month of her combat mission, she found herself not just accepted by the A-10 community, but actively sought out for her tactical expertise and combat experience. The same knowledge and capabilities that had been dismissed as theoretical were now recognized as having been proven under the most demanding conditions possible. What Sarah couldn't have anticipated was that her success would create opportunities, not just for herself, but for an entire generation of women who had been excluded from close air support roles based on the same institutional barriers she had overcome. 6 months after the Valley mission, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the Air Force Academy, looking out at an audience that included not just cadets but senior military leaders, congressional representatives, and media personnel from around the world. The podium bore the seal of the Air Force, but the real significance of the moment was represented by the 285 Marines sitting in the front rows, men and women whose lives had been saved by her actions in that distant valley. The ceremony wasn't just about recognizing Sarah's individual achievement. It had become a watershed moment for military aviation policy. The Distinguished Flying Cross she was about to receive represented the first time the medal had been awarded to a woman for close air support operations, but the broader implications extended far beyond individual recognition. General Patricia Hawkins, now Sarah's strongest supporter within Air Combat Command, stepped to the podium to present the award. "Captain Rodriguez, your actions on that day in Somalia represent everything we strive for in military aviation: courage under fire, tactical excellence, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those who cannot protect themselves." As Hawkins pinned the medal to Sarah's uniform, the applause was thunderous and sustained. But Sarah's attention was focused on the Marines in the front row, particularly Sergeant Maria Santos, a young woman who had been wounded in the Valley engagement, and whose life had hung in the balance during those critical hours when enemy forces had been closing in on the casualty collection point. "Ma'am," Santos had told Sarah during a private conversation before the ceremony, "when I was lying there bleeding, listening to those mortar getting closer, I thought I was going to die. Then I heard your plane, and I knew someone was fighting for us. You didn't just save my life, you showed me what it means to be a warrior." The formal ceremony concluded with Sarah's acceptance speech, but her words weren't directed at the dignitaries and officials in attendance. She spoke directly to the young women in the audience, the cadets and junior officers who had been told throughout their careers that certain roles were beyond their reach. "I stand here today not because I'm exceptional, but because I was given the opportunity to prove what I was capable of when it mattered most." Every woman in this audience has capabilities that haven't been fully recognized, skills that haven't been completely utilized, and potential that hasn't been entirely realized. Sarah's voice carried across the auditorium with the confidence that had enabled her to make split-second decisions under fire. The barriers that kept women out of combat roles weren't based on our limitations. They were based on other people's assumptions about our limitations. And assumptions, as we've seen, can be proven wrong when reality demands it. The impact of Sarah's success rippled through military aviation communities worldwide with unprecedented speed. Within 3 months of her combat mission, the Air Force had initiated a comprehensive review of all policies that restricted women's access to combat aviation roles. The review wasn't driven by political pressure or social advocacy. It was driven by operational necessity and the recognition that excluding qualified pilots based on gender was a luxury that military effectiveness couldn't afford. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, who had overseen Sarah's simulator training, found himself appointed to lead a new initiative designed to identify and develop female pilots for close air support roles. The Rodriguez case study has become required reading for all our senior leaders, Thompson explained to a gathering of military educators. It demonstrates that our previous assessment methods were failing to identify the full range of pilot capabilities available to us. The changes weren't limited to policy modifications. Sarah's tactical innovations during the Valley mission had introduced new procedures that were being incorporated into training programs throughout the close air support community. Her coordination of precision strikes with artillery support became a standard technique taught to all new A-10 pilots, while her methods for identifying and disrupting enemy command structures were studied in advanced tactics courses. Major Kevin Walsh, one of the pilots who had initially designed simulator scenarios to expose Sarah's supposed limitations, now served as her wingman and had become one of her most vocal advocates within the squadron. "Flying with Sarah has made me a better pilot," Walsh admitted during a squadron meeting. Her tactical awareness and decision-making under pressure set a standard that pushes everyone around her to perform at higher levels. The transformation extended beyond individual relationships to systemic changes in how the military approached gender integration in combat roles. Sarah's success had provided concrete evidence that previous concerns about unit cohesion, physical requirements, and operational effectiveness had been based on perceptions rather than reality. Within a year of her combat mission, Sarah found herself promoted to major and assigned as the commanding officer of a newly formed close air support training squadron. Her unit's mission was to develop the next generation of A-10 pilots, with special emphasis on identifying and nurturing non-traditional candidates who might have been overlooked by conventional selection processes. The squadron's first class included 12 pilots, 6 of whom were women who had been transferred from other aircraft, based on demonstrated aptitude for close air support operations. Sarah's training methods, developed from her own experience overcoming institutional barriers, produced graduation rates and performance metrics that exceeded traditional A-10 training programs. Major Rodriguez has revolutionized how we think about pilot development, observed Colonel Anderson, who had been promoted to general and now oversaw all Air Force close air support operations. Her emphasis on tactical knowledge, precision under pressure, and mission-focused decision-making has created a training standard that identifies the most capable pilots regardless of their background or previous experience. The international implications of Sarah's success became apparent when Allied Air Forces began requesting access to her training methods and tactical innovations. The techniques she had developed for coordinating complex close air support missions were being adapted by military aviation communities in NATO countries, creating a new standard for international cooperation in combat operations. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. Sarah's presence in leadership positions had normalized the concept of women in combat aviation roles to such an extent that the previous debates about gender integration seemed not just outdated but irrelevant. Young pilots entering the A-10 community now viewed her as simply an exceptionally capable officer, whose gender was no more significant than her height or hair color. Captain Lisa Phoenix Chun, one of Sarah's former students who had gone on to fly combat missions in the Middle East, captured the transformation perfectly during an interview with a military publication. Major Rodriguez didn't prove that women can fly close air support missions. She proved that the best pilots are the ones who can save lives when everything is on the line, regardless of anything else. The final validation of Sarah's impact came from an unexpected source: the enemy forces who had faced her in combat. Intelligence reports indicated that her tactical innovations and precision strikes had become case studies in their own training programs, with her mission being analyzed as an example of the kind of air support that could defeat even well-prepared defensive positions. As Sarah walked through the squadron ready room that evening, reviewing the training schedules for her next class of pilots, she reflected on how completely her professional world had changed. The young woman who had been told she didn't belong in A-10 cockpits was now responsible for training the pilots who would fly the most challenging close air support missions of the next decade. Her father's words echoed in her memory: "You shoot to protect people who can't protect themselves." But now she understood that protection extended beyond the immediate tactical mission to include protecting the aspirations and potential of every qualified pilot who had been told they didn't belong in the cockpit where they could be most effective. 285 Marines she had saved in that valley had become advocates for a principle that extended far beyond military aviation: that capability and courage were the only qualifications that mattered when lives hung in the balance. 2 years later, Sarah stood on the flight line at Bagram Air Base, watching as Captain Maria Santos, the same Marine she'd helped save in that valley, climbed into the cockpit of an A-10 for her first combat mission as a newly qualified pilot. The circle was complete. The woman who had once lain bleeding on a battlefield, listening to Sarah's cannon fire as salvation, was now preparing to provide that same salvation to others. "Ready to show them what we're made of, Captain," Sarah called out over the engine noise. Santos flashed a confident smile and gave her a thumbs up. "Just following your example, ma'am. Time to protect those who can't protect themselves." As Sarah watched Santos taxi toward the runway, she thought about all the young women across military bases worldwide who were no longer asking permission to pursue their dreams. They were simply preparing to prove they belonged wherever courage and skill were required. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had crumbled not through protests or policy changes, but through the undeniable power of performance under fire. Sarah had learned that sometimes the most effective way to change the world wasn't to argue with those who said it was impossible. It was to make the impossible look routine. Her radio crackled with a familiar voice. "Viper 1, this is Phoenix. Lead, Marines in Sector 7 need immediate close air support. Ready to show these guys how it's done?" Sarah smiled and keyed her microphone. "Phoenix lead, Viper 1 is ready. Let's go save some lives." As both aircraft lifted into the Afghan sky, 2 women pilots heading toward another group of Americans who needed protection, Sarah realized that her father's legacy lived on in ways he never could have imagined. What did you think of Sarah's incredible journey from rejection to recognition? Her story proves that courage and skill know no gender, only dedication and the will to succeed when lives are on the line. If this story inspired you, hit that subscribe button and join our community where we share amazing stories of people who refuse to accept limitations. What other barrier-breaking stories would you like to hear? Drop your suggestions in the comments below, and don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss another incredible tale of triumph against the odds.